Welcome to the second day. Thanks for being here. Today, our first speaker is Dr. Ángeles Eraña, a researcher here in the Instituto de Investigaciones Filosóficas. Thank you very much for being here and opening the second day. Welcome.
Thank you. So thank you for organizing this, and Luis for inviting me. I have to say that I am a bit surprised that I am invited because I'm not a logician. You will see that. Actually, I'm better described as a baby logic kind of colleague that's only taken those courses. But well, I have some things that, what I would say, I think, is a lot in accordance with what you have argued yesterday regarding the paper that logic can play in politics, particularly, and in politics, meaning more than just feminism, thinking about Gillian's preoccupations yesterday. And also, I'm not a feminist in the sense that I don't study feminism. I am not I don't do feminist theories. Of course, I agree with the idea that oppression has to be taken away from any domain. So in that sense, I am a feminist, but just in that sense. However, I will try to convince you that there are some things that can be said from outside of logic that might be appealing to logicians. So I hope that is actually the case. I'm going to talk about the distinction between binarism and complementarity, which I think are two ways of thinking about dualism, and I'll explain this better. So I am going to claim these things, which are very broad. I'm going to narrow them down as long as I advance. And my English is really rusty, so please be patient with me because I'm losing it. So ontology and politics are very closely related, and this is something that might seem not important, but I think it is, because politics is normally thought of as how power is put in play or how it's executed, and it has a lot to do with power. But not many people think about politics as being related with ontology. That is on how the world is actually composed and how it works. And I think that politics has a lot more to do with this latter thing than with the first, even though the first is important. The second claim is that ontology and logic are very closely related, and this is nothing new. You know, Quine said this in his own way. And but what I am trying to convey is that every logical statement has an ontological commitment within it, and that sometimes it just goes without noticing, but I think there is that, and we have to take to put attention on that. And logic, I think, helps capture some of the main ontological assumptions in an ontological arrangement. And if these two things are the case, then I think that logic and politics are very much closely related than normally thought. So, and this is part of what you were saying yesterday. I think that feminist logic, talking about and thinking about feminist logics, has a lot to do with this idea, because feminism is a political stance. So I think, and if you're trying to develop a feminist logic, well, I'm gonna think that you're right. So the main idea is that it is worth thinking about logic if one wants to imagine a different social organization, or in other words, if one wants to contribute somehow to the construction of a more just world. So my main preoccupation is justice, and I think that justice has to do with ontology. The plan, basically, this is how I will proceed. I will explain the kind of link I think there is between ontology and politics, and this will go really fast. Then I will explain the kind of relation I think there exists between ontology and logic, and here I will exemplify this idea by describing these two ways of thinking about dualism, complementarity and binarism. And I think that binarism and complementarity are two systems that come out of different ontological principles, and that they are both underlying ways of living the world and of being the world. So the complementarity, as you will see as we go further, is the way some of the Mesoamerican people thought of the world, how it is composed. And I think it implies certain ways of thinking about, well, it could imply a logic, some formal logics, but they have not been developed. So I will conclude that if 1 and 2 are the case, then there are good reasons to think that it is worth thinking more about logic in order to change the world. So the first thing I want to do is to just give you what will be something that I will assume in what follows, and it is important that you have it in mind, I think. Because I think that when we talk about society, because this has a lot to do with how I think about politics. I think that politics has a lot to do with social theory, more than with political philosophy, for example, and more than with, sometimes even with political theory. So I think that if we think politics in the way I want to think about it, then we have to take seriously social theory, to think about what society is. And the way I think about society, and this is very developed in a book I published some years ago, I think about society as a structured set of social relations. And this is important because I think that distinct structured sets result in different particular social systems. So, for example, capitalism is one arrangement of social relations, and feudalism is different. So in that sense, if social relations are articulated in a certain way, then you can immediately see that capitalism is taking place there, right? And it can be all over the world or in different places, even if it takes different particular characteristics. The way the relations are structured is the same, so it's the same social system. So the configurations of elements is not a random collection, but a hierarchically ordered organization where some elements are more fundamental and stable than others. And this is why I think it is a structure and not just a character. And I think this is important, and this is something I have argued further with the accent in a paper that is coming out now, in January. When social systems delineate correct or acceptable ways of thinking about facts, and this is important, and of moving around the world. So what I am trying to say here is that society not only organizes the way we relate among each other, but also the way things actually are. So society is not just a way of thinking about the world, but of the world being, of the way the world is. So in that sense, I am like a constructionist, a strong constructionist. I have some realist spaces, and I argue for them in the book, but I will just go really fast through that. So our ways of thinking about facts and moving around the world make up reality. And this is a practice that social practices make up reality, and they make up also the way we think about reality, so they make up reality. So reality is a socio-historical product that stems from human activity. It is constituted by its own set of social practices. So now that that's established, I can start talking about politics and ontology, because what I have said is what the world is. So society, when I talk about society and when I talk about the world, I'm talking basically about the same thing. So I think that politics has to do with the ability to take care of social problems. So if you think about the way normally politics is defined, it rarely is defined as something that is related to taking care of something. Rather, it is how we implement power, how legitimate violence is executed, and many other things. But I think that, and this is a lot Rancière's idea of politics. I am using that in order to put forward my ideas. So when I talk of social problems, of the specific problems that occur in the different possible arrangements of our systems of social relations. Taking care means, in this context, at least trying to change the conditions that make it possible for the problems to occur. So the main idea is you have to produce your practices in order to change the structured relations, and once that structure changes, you have changed the world. But it is not as easy to change the world because you actually have to change the structure. So that's why I think that changing individual acts is not enough for actually changing the world. So if this way of thinking about politics is accepted, then getting engaged with it implies making up a new society, a new world. In other words, a new ontology. So this is the way I think that politics and ontology are related. So ontology and logic. So I said that ontology has to do with social practices, not only social, because, well, I think that epistemic practices are social practices. So in that sense, it's just a subset of social practices, but we could be more picky about it and try to distinguish epistemic from social, from moral, from different kinds of practices. But also, and very importantly, ways of partitioning the world, and I think this is important, of categorizing whatever we take to be on it. So part of what we do is that we cut up the world in different pieces, and that the way we do that has to do with the way in which we think the world is. And we claim that there is a correspondence between the way we cut the world and the world as it actually is. But there, I think I am a bit Wittgensteinian, because I think that there is a definition of the world, and then inside that definition, your partitions work fine, and you can actually play the correspondence theory, but outside the system, I'm not certain if those partitions actually are true or work. So, and I think that what we have to acknowledge is that those systems are historically delimited, and they can be changed, they can be transformed. And so what used to be true in a system can be false in a new system. And so ideas that we take to be natural, like women are liars, are not natural in another. So, well, that's what part of what I'm trying to say. So one of the, here I am really worried of saying this here, because one of the main tasks of logic is to help organize thinking. I'm not sure, you'll tell me. And a fundamental task of thought is to categorize whatever we take the world to be made of. The way we think about the world is partly the way the world is, but one of the main tasks of logic is to help organize the world. So if you grant me this, I think the rest follows, but I don't know if you will. I hope you do. So different logics imply or presuppose different ontologies. And this is what I said at the beginning. And these ideas are much carefully developed in the book. Not all of them, but some of them. So I said this, different logics imply different ontologies. And what I'm trying to do now is to show that there is a main idea of how we categorize the world that has been around us, and this is more a descriptive thesis than a normative thesis, where there is an ontological commitment regarding dualism. So the idea that ontological categories come in pairs is something that has been around for a very, very, very long time. For example, in the Mesoamerican people, they used to think about pairs all the time, as I will show. And in logics, the classical logic, which most of you hate. So I don't know if you hate, but I think they also divided into pairs, and I think not only from what I heard yesterday, I think it's not only classical logics, but many other kinds of logics. I cannot be certain of this, but I think from what I heard that it is. Dualism is the idea that ontological categories are organized into pairs. But I think that we can think about dualism in the second two ways. You can assume either that in any pair of ontological categories, one of them is fundamental and the other derived. And this has a lot to do with this woman's name. You say Plumwood, exactly. And I think Plumwood actually would call what I am calling binarism, she calls dichotomism, I think, or dualism. Yes, so there I disagree, but I think it's terminological. For any pair of ontological categories, one is fundamental and the other derived. That is, for example, presence over absence, and we think always that absence is the lack of presence. One over many is derived from one. Men over women, and we can go doing this arrangement for many different pairs, which are not only objects or things, but also social kinds, if we want to keep the distinction between social kinds and natural kinds, which, if my previous argument works, I don't think that distinction really goes through, but it doesn't matter. Now, it doesn't matter now. So this is what I call binarism. And I think it is, if you think about it, it is very much in accordance with what feminists have called binarism, and which they have been fighting, the idea that there are binarism, there are only two genders, and you have to clearly distinguish them, and one is derived from the other, and this is a lot of what Plumwood also argues. So this is what I call binarism. It assumes substantialism, and this is for me very important, and abstraction, that is the idea that there exist types of entities with qualities. So as I will try to argue what follows, my idea is that binarism is committed to an object ontology, an objectual ontology. And the objects are substances, and substances are things which you can put on top of them qualities and relations. So relations are always secondary, they are not primary. What is primary is the substance, is the object. And then we can think on the other side that any pair of ontological categories, there is no fundamentality, but rather mutual dependence. This is what I will call complementarity. It assumes relationalism and concreteness and processualism. So basically, this kind of ontological commitment, what it says is that if there is anything which is fundamental ontologically, it's the relationship itself. So everything is always related, and nothing is independent of whatever else is there. These two, as I have said already, have been captured by, have been captured by different sets of thinking, not of logical principles, because rather by ontological principles, I'd say. But I think probably you will notice that there I am a bit less clear on what is a logical principle, a logical law. And yesterday I noticed it, and I was a bit worried because I don't know which are exactly the differences between those things. But let me show you what I'm going to say. So I said already the world can be divided or organized into polarities, into discrete categories that are made up of two different opposite and mutually exclusive parts. And I think that there are three main principles, which are the identity principle, the non-contradiction, and the excluded middle. Yesterday you talked about the two second ones, but now I'm going to talk about the three of them, but I think that what I'm doing that you didn't do is the identity principle. And I think that these are, well, in the book, what I say is that these are ontological principles, which have their logical correlative principles or laws or whatever they are. So the identity principle, mainly it says, I hope nobody asks me to formalize it, because I would not really want to do that. Don't ask me to do that. So this principle mainly says that what exists is fixed and identical to itself. And I think that what is on the supposition that is underlying this principle is the idea that the world is made out of substances, as I already said, that do not require anything else to exist. So a substance is something that by itself exists and persists. Then what happens to it through its development is completely accidental. It's not what it actually is. Even if you are not an essentialist, you can be a substantialist, which is not an essentialist, and maintain that substances exist by themselves. So if you think about this, and this is part of my argument in the book, this is very in accordance with individualism, because each substance is one and for itself. So I think that everything starts to come together, and it's a social relation arrangement which has these suppositions underlying it. So every substance is one. It's not a universal, but it is the base of everything that there is. And of course, substances cannot be universals. Since reality is made out of substances with properties which can be accidentally held, reality can be said to be discrete. Its root is one, and then many is always derived from one. So I think that this is what is underlying the identity principle, and I think that if I am correct, then individualism requires and depends a lot on this principle. The non-contradiction, probably Pramod and Roy yesterday are going to say more, how do you say this, more things that are more pertinent for your interests, but I hope this tells you something. What I think is that each item that exists is the item it is because it is not the other, one that opposes it, another whose existence implies necessarily the inexistence of the one. So this is somehow what Talmud says. In other words, actually, when I wrote this, I hadn't read Talmud, I read her afterwards, and then I said, oh, this had been said before. I didn't know that. So I think that what this presupposes is that nothing can be and not be, well, it's obvious, nothing can be and not be at the same time. Everything that is not one is derived, not complete. And this is very important because everything that is not one is something which is not ontologically complete. It requires the other, but at the same time, the other can be what it is. And so oppression comes naturally, because the only things that are complete need to give the other things what they require in order to be complete. So women require men to be complete. Well, of course I don't think it, but of course I don't think so. So one and the other are not only different, but antagonistic. And this is also important. And the excluded middle. This is the way I think about it. Each item is always identical to itself and different from any other that is not itself. And I think that this can be read as follows. Reality is the way it is and cannot be otherwise. I think that that is what is implied by this principle. And I don't think this has been very much said. And I think I can still think about this because this is something I've just stumbled with recently. Talking with a mathematician, which is interesting. She is a feminist and mathematician, and she read my book and she wrote and she said, don't you think that the excluded middle actually implies this? And I started thinking about it, and I think she's right. So these three principles in conjunction reflect the structure of rationality and capture the way the world is. A rationality is naturally binary. It organizes its contents in dichotomical terms in virtue of exclusive oppositions. These have allowed us to conceive the world as if it was made of antagonic pairs, structured through bipartite divisions. And remember, the world as we conceive it is not different from the world as it is. So our world is, but as it is, our world as it is now is partition. And so we have to actually change it so that those things don't work anymore. So on the other hand, we have the complementarity principles. And this is something that I have called the ontology of not only me, many other people have talked about the ontology of the common, but I am trying to look to Mesoamerican principles. And also some of these things come out from the Zapatistas' writings. If you read them, I think you can find good reasons to think that these principles are still underline the way they think about the world, and they underline the way they are constructing their political realities. And it is really interesting to go and see what they're doing, because it is another world, actually. So if there is so the ontology of the common is not an abstract theory of what there is, rather it has a historical and social character. If there is something which could be said to be fundamental, it is relationality, as I already said. The link is not inside or outside, it is between whatever two things there are. The glue in reality is whatever is shared, not something fixed, because whatever is shared is something that is constructed through relationality. So even if you think we have to fight for the common good is not something that is already established, and it's not something that the elites can tell you what it is. It's something that has to come out of relationships, of social relationships. So the complementarity principles, I don't know how to call them. So the principles, and these are what you can find in the writings of the Mesoamerican, in some writings of the Mesoamerican peoples, and in the writings of the Zapatistas. They're not mentioned like this. This is work that has been done by anthropologists and by some feminist women. For example, Mariana Favela, who is a student of mine, she was a student of mine, now she's her own self. But she has worked a lot on this. So one of what they bring out of studying their writings is 5 principles. I'm just going to talk about 3 of them, which I think are important for us. One is the duality principle. In Amerindian thought, it is used to explain the order of the universe, its movement, and its intrinsic diversity. So one of the things that they think is that if there is no movement, there is no reality. So in order for reality to exist, movement has to happen. So there is processuality going on. Everything is a process. It refers to particulars which are not single unities, but pairs. So what they say is, in order for there to be movement, there cannot be a single thing. The single thing has to stop being and give place to another thing existing. And that other thing depends on the one and the other one. So there is a mutual continual dependence from one to the other. So what they say is earth and sky, hot and cold, men and women are conceived of as polar pairs. So they are different, but they are only complete if they are together. So completeness is for each of the parts of the pair, but only if they are together. If they are not together, they are not complete. So their terms seem to be opposite, but it is impossible to conceive one without the other, and thus they complement each other. That's their idea. The linking principle is used to explain the relatedness of existence. And what it says mainly is that whatever exists is made out of complex relationships. So what I think when I think about the linking principle is about, for example, termitero, how do you say that? Donde las termitas viven?
Termite mount.
Yes. And so you see that thing only exists if there is land, if there are the little and all the little animals that are eaten by the termites. And so it's something that can only exist if every single part. And also something that has been said by, I can't remember her name, but she's a feminist, that we are made out of bacteria, water. We are made out of so many different things, and we are dependent on all those things. So I think this principle mainly is aiming at that kind of thinking. And the duality principle. And I think it's better to call it here the parity principle, because if not, it confuses us with what I said is dualism. And also because what it implies is more a parity, the idea of being pairs of parity than of duality. So one entity cannot exist without the other or another, a complementary pair. Only if one is two can it walk whatsoever. This is part of what I said a little while ago. There is light only if there is dark, and vice versa. the world is made out of multiple pairs dualities, which constantly unfold and overlap. So they are constantly changing, continuously translate from one term into the other and constitute an integral whole. So the idea is that every pair is a totality. And but it's not a complete totality, nor is it completely determined because it's possession. The link, wait. Yes, so oh, I came back to the linking principle. Well, the linking principle basically says that existence is grounded in a warp over and above which a weft is inserted, giving place to particular ways of time stops up. So on top of these structures, different weaves can start to show. Each weave is a coupled pair. And this is the idea. Lajo is a South American philosopher, and Favela is Mariana, my student. Everything that exists is related, or more importantly, bonding with other existences, looking for the proportion, oscillating between affinities and repulsions. And this is important because it's not just the idea that affinities is what bind us together, but also repulsions, and the idea that repulsion is important. Not everything is nice and sweet, and that's important. The relatedness of existence is fundamental and leads to the idea of totality. Each term of a pair is what it is in virtue of its being part of a totality. So I think that binarism and complementarism have political consequences, and this has to do with my starting arguments. So I think that binarism implies an individualistic ontology, as I already mentioned, each one for itself. This is one of the main supports of capitalism and neoliberalism. Capitalism has brought with it an unjust way of living. So I think it's a good idea to start thinking of changing. In fact, there are many feminists who think that capitalism and patriarchy go hand in hand, and that you cannot end with one if you don't end with the other one. And I mainly agree with them. I think they are right. It's a dualism, but in fact it is complementarism. Implies a collectivist or communitarian. But I don't want to say communitarian because people start thinking about communitarism, Taylor's, and I'm not talking about that. I'm mostly talking about, for example, what the Zapatistas are doing in their political reality, which is the idea that you construct the common by working every day in communalities or something like that. So a collectivist ontology, each one for the others, which are oneself. So one is who one is because one is the others. We don't know how it works in our big city lives, but it helps in imagining a new ontology and thus a new different world. Probably thinking about it leads to imagine ways to finish with capitalism, and for our purposes here, probably it helps thinking in some other logics. So it seems interesting to think about logics in order to think about the way the world is or can be. And that's it. Thank you. ¿Tú controlas? No sé qué se dice. No, el micrófono.
Is it on that? We have 35 minutes for questions. If anyone has any question. Okay.
Okay. No, I mean, I know a lot of this stuff, but I really like you bringing up the complete incomplete distinction, because that's also another dualism that is rarely brought up. However, you mentioned it and then you kind of left it behind and you didn't develop it. So I'm going to try just to push you in that direction, because I didn't get in the end whether there's anything that is ever complete or in order for the process to be always ongoing, everything has to be incomplete?
I love this question.
Okay, then I'm gonna keep pushing, because that can mean either that everything is incomplete in at least one respect, or that it has to be in some or in all, a must. I don't know. That's what I want to know. Because also something that is at least very strongly suggested from the complementarity and the parity principles is that whatever is complete cannot be simple, cannot be individual, but that in the end, systems, especially systems of mutual complementarity, or at least in a certain ideal state of fitting together, they could eventually be complete. Or you think that even that cannot be ever complete?
Okay.
And
so,
why?
Yeah. So I think that the answer to the second depends on the answer to the
Yes,
first.
of course.
So I think that completeness is something which can be achieved in a temporary fashion. So
Okay.
something can be complete for a moment, but then the process continues and it becomes incomplete. And part of the complementarism has to do precisely with that fact. You are complete, but then you become incomplete, but then, and I'm saying you, but whatever it is, no?
Yes.
The item is complete, or the system is complete, and then it is. And part of what makes it incomplete is that nothing is ever perfect. Everything is always being perfecting itself or something like that. So since perfection is not something you achieve, but something you aim at, you're always like moving. And I think this has a lot to do with pragmatism thought. For example, I think that the idea of that doubt is something you want to get out of,
Yes.
because it is very angustiante, how do you say that? Very
An itch.
it makes you not being comfortable. So you want to get out of it. But at the same time, it's the motor of inquiry. If you don't try to get out of doubt, if you actually achieve certainty, you stop inquiring because you're thinking you've arrived to the place you wanted to be. So I think that same idea, well, an analogy of that idea is what I have in mind, because so what you have to do is always you're aiming at perfection, or but it's not something you are going to achieve. But moving in that direction keeps things going, because also if you take seriously these principles, then if you don't move, you cease to exist.
Yeah, but my question was, what is it? What if you could even spell even better the relation between this dynamicism and continuous instability with the complete and the incomplete? Because it would seem very natural to think that incompleteness is kind of primary, which I know you don't want to, because then it would generate a new system,
no,
right?
Yes.
So that's what I don't see. I don't see how something can be complete and still
move.
Okay.
So
it's the old Parmenides question.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. I don't know if I have
A full grasp. Okay.
Yeah, but I am thinking about Rita Segato's idea.
Okay.
Rita Segato, what she says, she's a feminist, and she talks about pre-colonial relationships between men and women, and about dualism in pre-colonial society. And what she says is that there was a division of labor, and there was a division of everything between men and women in those societies, but that each of them, they depended on the other, and there was oppression, there was everything, but the relationships were different. So they depended on each other, because each had some, and each of them were complete by themselves. But when they were, because ontologically there was nothing they were lacking, but at the same time they could only be complete. I don't know how to say this. I don't know how to say this, because they needed the other, but I don't know how to say this. What she says is that they need the other. They can only be a totality if they are together, but by themselves, each is complete. So I guess that there are two notions of completeness.
Yes. Now.
Which I would have to work a little bit more with. I don't know if this helps.
Yeah, no, it helps a lot.
Okay.
Thank you.
You have a question?
This was really cool and reminded a little bit of some work by one of Roy's colleagues, Kat Sinclair, who does really interesting stuff on like Native American almost like modeling, which I don't know, you might find interesting. But what I wanted to ask about was, so it's especially interesting to compare the kind of like dualism that Plumwood was criticizing with this like different, more dynamic dualism.
Yes.
The one thing I wanted was, they both seem like it involves like two things. And I wondered, so people who think things like gender is a spectrum or
Yes. Yes.
like don't want to count and end up with two.
Yes.
Is there space for that? Is it compatible with?
Yes. That's a great question. I think it does. I think I am pushing the analogy in order to make the complementarity principles to contrast clearly with the binary principles. But I think that the main idea, but I don't even think they're thinking about los micrófonos. I don't think they're even thinking about things that are made out of three, but rather everything is always a continuum. So you're being a man and a woman all the time because you are, and of course, there's a problem if those are the only two categories. I think that has a lot to, the better way to understand this would be to start thinking of different ways of categorizing, where there are not only two terms for naming whatever there is. And I think that requires new political imagination. So I think that's a work I still have to do, and not only me, but I think that would be, that would not be a problem for these kind of principles to take into account. Actually, if you see the way their communities work, that happens. So that is something that happens. And it's interesting to see that it's not even something they are thinking about, it just happens. And then when they theorize about themselves, they say, oh, this is happening, and they write it down. So it's really interesting.
Yes. I would like to understand more what you're thinking when you talk about the world in an hegemonical sense. Because one way to think about it would be the Anglo-European world and its sphere of influence, but I don't know if you also mean to include, for example, China and India. And I think that is, I don't know, it's complex because China has its own brand of state capitalism, for example, but it's still some type of capitalism. And there are also production related, I don't know how to say it. It's not production. I forgot the word, but the chain of production, for example, for many goods includes China. So even if you would say that China is outside that way of making the world, it's still part of the modern production system in some sense. So my doubt, that is my doubt. But when you talk about the world,
yes, yes. I don't know enough about China or India, but I think I know just as just what I need to know in order to answer your question. That's why I talk about structured sets of relationships, because I think that if you look at how China works, at least now, it is a capitalist country. it responds to all the kind of relationships that structure capitalism, where there is oppression, there is an elite, there is a chain of production which aims at plus valor, generating surplus, and all these kind of things, which is not only economical, but all because the economic, what Marx said is that the economical was what was most important. But I think that what is important is that this kind of social, of production relations produce different kind of social relations beyond the productivity dimension. So what you generate when you have the worker and the employee and the trabajador y el patrón, what you have that is that you repeat that kind of relationship outside the la fábrica. No? So you go to the schools and it's the same kind of structure of relation structure. And so if you see how China works now, I think it is a capitalist system. And India, I don't know, but I think it is too. I don't know. I couldn't say much about India because I have never studied India, but it'd be interesting to see.
Thank you.
So that's what I'm thinking about mainly. And that's why at the beginning I started with that, because I think it's important to think that what I'm looking at is structures, and probably I am just equating things that might be a bit different. For example, I think that capitalism in general is not exactly the same as neoliberalism, but I think that neoliberalism is a form of capitalism and that it just has new ways of presenting itself. So capitalism has the virtue of transforming itself all the time so that it always appears as a new system. But if you take a closer look, it's the same structure. It's the same structural set of relationships. And that's what I'm saying. And where war is very important. War is part of that structured set of relations, I think.
Thank you very much.
Thomas and then Bryan.
I think Bryan had his.
Bryan and then Thomas.
Okay. We can go out in the hall and fight about it. Oh, I probably don't need this, but so I was just, this is super cool, by the way. But of course I'm like thinking about, okay, how do we formalize this now? I'm not gonna say anything too rough. So I mean, I think you're right. One really promising way is could be to connect this to Plumwood and to some of the debates we were talking about yesterday. But another thing struck me that hadn't struck me as interesting in these contexts of like the larger feminist philosophy context until your talk, that in particular some of the things you're worried about between the binary versus complementarity, there's a version of this you could do. It's probably not as promising as the bigger connected to Plumwood and alternative logics, but still maybe worth looking at, is the difference here between whether this distinction can be tied to the difference between explicit and implicit definitions, right? Because with let's just say man and woman, right? With an explicit definition, you've got to pick a priority. It's either you're defining man as not woman, right? So we already understood woman and now we're applying an operation to it to get man, or what is actually probably more common is woman is not man. Man is the prior one, then we get woman is sort of this. Whereas we can give an implicit definition where we just do something like exclusive or, you know, man woman, right? Which is, or man exclusive or woman, which is logically equivalent, right? I mean, the claim to develop either of the two if and only if man if only not woman, woman if only woman if and only if not man. Man exclusive or exclusive or woman is, once you start doing the reasonings, equivalent, but it doesn't prioritize one, right? Implicit definitions allow us to just talk about the way they're related to each other without prioritizing one as prior to the other. It seems like, and this might be a nice way to get at some of what you're after, is that captures at least sort of the basic difference. I think for the full political project, you probably still want to do the more complicated stuff. But it seems like that's a nice way to sort of really tease out the basic structure of the difference.
Yeah,
so
that's really
it's not really a question. I didn't
no, thank you. No, that's great. Yeah, thank you.
Hi, thank you. That was a great talk. I wanted to ask about the sort of, I'm not a philosopher of I don't do this kind of political stuff. So forgive me if I sound dumb, but the whole sort of ontological approach to political movements that you described in the first part, I thought was really, really interesting. And I wanted to know if you thought that had any consequences for how to look at the notion of like a political coalition, right? Because I assume that you can have sort of fine-grained ontologies in this sense. And sometimes in coalitions, you have kind of uncomfortable partners that are all on the same side that may be heavily individualistic on one axis, but then more dualistic in your sense on another axis. I was wondering if there was a way to translate political coalitions into the sort of ontological realm instead of just agreements of expediency, but rather like there's a shared core ontology, or there's a translation between these two ontologies, or how you might look at that through the ontological lens.
Yes, I think that one way to think about it is I think coalitions would be very important in a. If you're a pluralist, you have to somehow allow for coalitions to take place, because if not, and I think that precisely one of the problems with the binary ontology is that it doesn't allow for coalitions because it's either one thing or not. And I think that in this more, the complementary ontologies, what is pluralist in the sense that it allows for different things to be taking place inside of it. How exactly, I still don't know, but I think that coalitions would be very important. So I've been doing some work in political stuff and more precisely on epistemic justice and how it has political consequences. And I think that part of what is important there is that if you think that coalition implies consensus, then you will not get coalitions. So I think that coalitions have to start by recognizing, acknowledging conflict. And so, yes, I think that coalitions in this ontology can be taken into account, because part of what this ontology recognizes is that there is conflict all the time, because precisely in that movement of becoming one thing or the other, what happens is conflict. What Alfredo López Austin, who is a historian, he died already, but he has worked a lot on this. What he said is that there was only that when the day was, what the Amerindians thought, that was when the day was starting to appear and the night had to hide itself, there was a huge conflict between them, and that they used to fight, but that each of them knew that they had to give place to the other one in order for them not to cease to exist. So that's part of what I think that coalitions would imply. Recognizing that sometimes you have to be silent in order for the others to have their voice heard, and the other way around. So everybody has to be heard, but that implies sometimes being quiet. And so learning to silence yourself for coalitions is very important. I hope I answered you.
Oh, that was very cool. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was really fun and really thought-provoking. And I can't wait to see some formalization.
Yeah.
And I'm really curious, because it's not clear, like, that, just at first glance, what that would resemble, and if it were like a regular, non-classical logic that's already well known would do that. There might be commonalities, there might be lots of things to work on, but I was really curious if you have anything to say about how the logic that you conceive of in complementarism, how it contrasts with really well thought about dialectical logics.
Yes. Yes, many people think that this is and it has a lot to do, because dialectic is precisely the other. But I think that what has been said by people who study these kind of principles is that the dialectic logic always thinks, and this is something I said when I answered to Axel, and I think in that sense, that's not a good answer. Because it's as if you were in a spiral trying to get someone. And this is not what dialectic logic thinks that. Yes, and I don't think, so probably I have to retract from my answer to Axel and think about it better, because what you're saying is very important. That is a crucial difference between those two things.
And those logics have been well developed, like there's in contemporary logic, we have that sort of, we actually have people who have, like Bryan who have showed how his system LP maps to the Hegelian or Marxian dialectic. So this could be a real challenger in a very interesting way. So I think you're on to something really, really interesting. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you for your talk. It was really cool and really inspiring because it reminded me that well, I should begin by saying that I don't really have a question. Rather, I'm here to tell you that there is more logic involved than you think. Because I just came to the realization that Luis and I once like experimented with contradictory logic. Because we wanted to expand the horizons of contradictory logics. And it struck me that it's really curious that we face two objections that are really similar to two of your concerns, right? So basically the idea was that we wanted contradictions to be logical truths of the system. And then we had to face this issue that exactly it amounted to treating contradictions as a whole, right? As a totality, but also while holding that both A and not A were complete by themselves, right? And then the second thing was that, like, thinking sort of classically, that would imply that A or not A, like the standard logical truth, would be a logical falsehood. And that would be rather uninteresting because it would just amount like to reversing logic. Like, it was easy to say, well, if you start reading disjunctions as conjunctions and vice versa, then you would get just good old classical logic would reverse. And then the challenge was exactly explaining how to make it more interesting, right? So that A and not A didn't turn out to be a plain old-fashioned logical falsity or something else. And other than that, well, there's the fact that if that were a little bit more developed, so to speak, I think that this would be fit really nicely as an interpretation, right? For those concerned that logical systems need sort of an application to be plausible, to count like as something other than a mere technicality.
Yeah.
I think this would fit in quite nicely.
Oh, that's great.
Well, the other thing is that FDE is my favorite workhorse, precisely because you can do that distinction like in a less radical way. You have the fact that contradictions are not always false, but then they're not always true, as well as excluded middle, right? It's like bound to have some exceptions, but not in every context.
Okay.
So I think that would be like a really nice way to get your feet wet, right? Working with a very consistent, very complete logic. But there is like the other, I think, more interesting bits.
Oh,
So don't give up. Yeah, there's no logic. Like,
no, I don't.
Unadulterated logic.
No, I know why he invited me. No, that's great. That's great to hear. I don't know if I'll ever do that because I don't know what about the logic is. I don't that's I'm offering. Right, yes, let's do that. Yes. Great. Thank you. Yes.
There was a question? Yeah. Yes. Hi. I'm not a philosopher, but I'm a Buddhist. And that's why I want to talk. And it was great that I was just next to her, because I was thinking that complementary does not help you to escape binarism at all, because you're still trapped in categories. But if you go into non-dualism, then you can escape those categories. And you can do it using contradictory logics that accept paradox, as in Buddhism. You can do that in non-duality. So there is a beautiful text by, I think it's Graham Chapman, that is a philosopher from the New York State University, and he demonstrates all this concept of interconnection, Buddhist interconnection with logics, and it's beautiful. I can
yes,
share it with you, and it's beautiful. So I think non-duality is a way to escape of these categories.
Thank you. Part of my worries always is that when you go non something, you're just turning it around instead of subverting it. And I think that part of my concern is how to subvert the logic and the ontology underlying reality. And I think that there are a lot of things that are underlying this way of thinking that are very, very much in close to some things that Buddhism or Buddhists say. But I would really like to read that. Thank you.
I like it when you present the connection between politics and ontology, and the connection between ontology and logic. But I have a question, and how we make sure that the first connection has the same nature as the second connection.
Which connect the logic, the ontology politics?
Yes. For the transitivity.
Yes, I know. I don't know. I don't know. I don't know. Help me to find out. I cannot say anything else. I have to think about it. I don't know.
Okay, thank you.
No, but thank you for the question. I think it's a good question. Yeah.
Anyone else has a question? I
have a question regarding what happens in the relationship between the subaltern group and hegemonic group, because the binary in the binary logic, negation is sort of canceling the alternative, but in the complementary logic, it is not meant to be read that way. But what happens when the subaltern group is negating the oppressive principles? Is that also a negation that is to be read as complementarity? Which that would seem strange, because it would be like saying oppression has a place in the pluralistic world we're trying to build, but it seems that that's a stronger negation. But also, you wouldn't want it to be that binary negation. So what happened with that?
Yes. So what I think, let me think in the ontological term. The idea is that if you actually have a world which is governed or made up with a complementary ontology, then parity is the case. So you don't have oppressed groups. So part of what I'm trying to say is that in order for their oppression to exist, you have to have something close to violence. Do I answer? So how would that translate into negation, or I don't know? How would negation work in a complementary logic? It's something I cannot answer.
Okay, a different question, but
yeah,
how would you characterize rebellion? Is rebellion something that is done in a system of thoughts, or not?
I think rebellion is something that in a complementary world would take place all the time, because rebellion and conflict go hand by hand, and conflict is something you're not trying to avoid. It's something that is happening all the time. So rebellion is something that takes place all the time, and is just acknowledging it is taking place and doing something with it. So if we think that conflict and rebellion are related in this way, it would have place there all the time, but not in a violent fashion. So I think the problem with rebellion is not rebellion by it. Actually, I think it's very important. And I think that many philosophies, not analytic philosophies, have studied that. For example, I think that the idea that repetition implies change which is the Derridian idea. That idea is a way of thinking about organism. So repeating our traditions, in fact, changing tradition, because every time you repeat them, you put something new on them, and so that changes. And if you make that something explicit, if you somehow make this something that all the others take into account and start repeating the difference made by the repetition, then what you have is a rebellion. That's part of what rebellion, I think.
Thank you very much.
Someone else has a question? Well, then we can go to the brief recess, and thank you again very much.